Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
What is a Hoosier? Something more, I would think, than a point guard on a basketball team. But what makes Hoosiers different from people in Illinois and Michigan and Ohio, even California and New York for that matter? Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about what is a Hoosier, what does a Hoosier think, and is a Hoosier really different? Our guests are Ron Hicks, who is Director of the Center for International Programs and Professor of Anthropology at Ball State University, Dwight Hoover, Director of Middletown Studies and a Professor of History at Ball State, and John Rouse, our Executive Producer and a Professor of Political Science here at Ball State. John, why do we spend 27 minutes, 46 seconds today discussing what's a Hoosier for Hoosiers?
Well, it came up, Larry, last week. We were discussing the Iran-Contra hearings, and my perception was that perhaps because of low taxes, because with low taxes perhaps you get less emphasis upon education, and so therefore as you have less education, you have more of a focus for citizens to submit to authority. And then following that along, they would be less likely to ask questions to challenge authority, and therefore they would be pro-Ollie North. Well, Earl Kahn, who is also a member of this panel, disagreed and essentially said, as I recall, that Indiana was as diverse and as American as any state. And so essentially last week we had a disagreement about the perceptions of culture and Indiana culture. So I thought it would be good for us to focus upon what is a Hoosier and what are some of the facets then of culture in Indiana.
Ron Hicks, are we a melting pot of sorts here in Indiana?
We are to some extent, but there's a lot of homogeneity as well. I think it depends to some extent on what part of the state you're looking at. To really understand Indiana culture, I think you have to look at the immigration patterns into the state and what the cultural backgrounds of the people are. If you, as we were mentioning before the show, people up along the Michigan border talk about Michiana, and in many ways the northern part of the state really isn't typically Hoosier. Likewise, if you get down close to the Ohio River, you find ties much more to the south. But I think if you look into the historical background, there were two major broad streams of immigration into Indiana, and I think they have had a lot to do with the way the culture is today.
Could we then change state lines to define cultures as opposed to following rivers and whatnot?
I think the state line you have to ignore, because what we think of as typical Hoosier culture does extend to some extent over into Ohio and into Illinois. But the geographical nature of Indiana and its placement has obviously had a historical impact on the kind of people that came in here and when they came in here.
Dwight Hoover, is a Hoosier different?
I think so, sure. May have a vested interest in that, but I think it's been a long tradition that there are Hoosiers. The word first appeared about the time that we became a state, and people defined what Hoosiers were then, and I think now. I think that our own peculiar experience has made us different than other states.
The word Hoosier is something of a funny word. Of course, it has a generic meaning that even brought debate on the floor of the Senate when Dan Quayle objected to a definition in Webster's. Is there a definition for a Hoosier?
Well, there are all kinds of stories about how the word originated. I think Senator Quayle is going against common usage. It is true that the word Hoosier has tended to mean a rustic and someone who might be a little bit of a rube. I don't know whether you can change that or not. There are several stories about the derivation of the name. One of them is that in early pioneer days, a traveler going through Indiana would knock at a cabin door to get lodging for the night, and the inhabitants would say, "Who's there?" And that's where they got the name Hoosier. There are several other arguments. One shows more sophistication, and that is that in the 1820s, a hussar who was with Napoleon in his Russian campaign came through the state on a speaking tour and aroused so much enthusiasm that people said, "We want to be hussars too." but the word Husser then became corrupted into Hoosier. And a final, well, there are still other versions. A final version, which is more indicative of a rustic nature, was that in barroom fights, saloon fights, during pioneer days, people would lose their ears in fights, and the bartender cleaning up would look down and say, "Whose ear?"
Well, Dwight, I also was concerned about an authoritative definition, so I went to my dictionary. The dictionary was published in the early 60s. It said that a Hoosier, mountaineer, dirty person, tramp, Southern Indiana was largely settled by Kentucky mountaineers. Webster's New World Dictionary, College Edition, 1960. Now, that's the dictionary definition. In terms of the phrase culture, I think it's important for us to look upon a definition there as well. According to a source, culture means that complex whole that includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So essentially we're asking today, what are some of the morals, the laws, the customs, the capabilities, the habits, the beliefs, the knowledge that distinguishes Hoosiers, those of us who live within the confines of Indiana, as having different or the same as perceptions as other Americans. And as last week we looked at the two basic issues. I said, for example, that Hoosiers believe perhaps in opportunity, but not equal opportunity. Hoosiers are very industrious, hardworking people. And also, they, in terms of the issues we talked about last week, which was a focus upon the Iran-Contra hearings, they would tend to be more authoritarian because lack of education. Do you think there's, perhaps you'd disagree with that assessment?
No, I think there is a definite culture. I think we're shaped by our particular experiences. It seems to me that there are several facets of the Hoosier experience that would give us a different culture. You've indicated some of them. The nature of the state, one large city, major city, and not many intermediate cities, I think is important. A rural background. I think Ron's point, not much immigration, particularly in the period of great ethnic migration to the U.S. from 1890, say, to 1910. We don't, Indiana is the lowest state in the Midwest to bring in migrants from South Central and Eastern Europe. They just don't arrive here. Now, Gary is an exception, but people would argue, and I think I would agree with them, that Gary is really part of Chicago. It really isn't part of Hoosier land. So I think this fact that you have a large number of second generation or older Americans does have a particular impact upon the state and make it, I think, a more conservative state. When the Lynns came to study Middletown, they deliberately picked a town that didn't have many ethnic groups, and Muncie, for example, was the least ethnic of any of the cities they considered. Over 88% of the people here were second-generation Americans. So you don't have that particular element to bring perhaps cultural change or some kind of cultural conflict. So you tend to, I think, reinforce your older preconceptions. If you believe that newer waves of migrants bring in new cultural values, then perhaps it didn't happen here.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue of ethnicity, the ethnic factor. Here in Muncie, we seem to have very few Poles or Jews and so forth, whereas the Poles and Jews, the ethnic groups would be found perhaps in Michigan City or places like that.
Really across that industrial northern part of the state. Linguistically, Indiana's sort of interesting because it's been argued that there are 5 regional dialects within Indiana. We talk about Hoosier dialect, and I'm not so sure there is a single Hoosier dialect. And that region that you mentioned up in the northwestern corner of the state is much more linked with Chicago, and it has more late 19th century immigrant elements in the dialect. Northeastern Indiana, on the other hand, over around Fort Wayne, is sort of a standard American. It doesn't have anything distinctive about it particularly. The whole central Indiana is a mix of New York State, New England elements, with others that came in from the south, and as you get down toward the southern end of the state, you get more and more of a highland south, which really gets us back to the question of ethnicity, because where did these people come from originally? And your statement about the lack of education having something to do with the authoritarian outlook may be one element. I'm wondering if another element may be the fact that Hoosiers, there's a very strong Germanic element in Hoosier culture as well. Even if you look at the early immigration, a lot of the people who came up here right as the Indians moved out from, in western Indiana, at least in the area I grew up, were basically Germanic. They were Pennsylvania Dutch who had migrated down to Tennessee, then came back up into Indiana. But in parts of western Indiana, even though these people had been in the Americas for 100 years and more, still in the late 1800s, the church services were in German, for example.
Ron, I've got to ask you this question. Excuse me for interrupting.
Sure.
Where are the Indians?
Well, the Indians stuck around for a long time. Theoretically, the Indians were moved out of the state in the 1840s. Indiana was dominated by the Miami. You had a number of other tribes in here. The Delaware sort of got pushed west and settled all along the White River. They moved out pretty early. The Delaware were really here for only about 30 or 40 years. The Miami, though, held on, and the Miami had intermarried with French traders, so how much influence that had on the later culture isn't too clear, but probably half the Miami stayed in the state and simply intermarried with the other people moving in. That Miami influence is concentrated in north central Indiana. Kokomo was sort of the center of the old Miami territory, the so-called Great Miami Reserve. But if you go up into the area around Peru, the lower Mississinawa River area, all along the Wabash there, you had very persistent Miami culture. And you still have a lot of people who think of themselves as being Miami up through there.
Dwight, how did we get the name Indians? I presume in 1816 they just decided that this was the appropriate title.
Yes. Well, as you know, Jefferson had some names for the states he wanted to use to divide them up, but that fortunately nobody selected the names that he used, which were a combination of Latin and I don't know what else. No, I'm not sure who named the states. I think it was Congress, actually, probably, but I don't know where the names came from. There were Indians here, but of course there were Indians almost everywhere else. People do associate Indiana with Indians. I remember being in Yugoslavia once, and a fellow who was entertaining us, who was the provost of the university, said, "What do Indians look like?" And luckily, we had a translator that looked exactly like an Indian. I said, "He looks just like that." And he was quite amused. I don't know whether the fellow was a Croatian or a Montenegrin or what he was, but he certainly resembled an Indian. And I thought it was ironic to go to Yugoslavia and look like I do and talk to a fellow who looks more like an Indian than somebody from Indiana.
Is it unique, Ron, that there are several dialects spoken in Indiana, or is that typical of a lot of states?
That's typical, I think, of a lot of states. To some extent, as you move west, you get fewer dialects. The eastern U.S. tends to have a lot more dialects. Look at New York. New York City itself, you can divide into dialects, subdialects within the different boroughs. So I think it's fairly typical, certainly of the northeastern part of the United States. And again, a lot of it has to do with the question of when people moved in and what their backgrounds were.
How has our background manifested itself today? I mean, we can look at Indiana as different from New York politically. We're a politically conservative state. What are some of the ways that this is really our culture, our background has manifested itself in what a Hoosier is or thinks or does today?
It's an interesting point you bring up about being conservative. When I did a book some years ago, Pictorial History of Indiana, the editor asked me this question. He said, "I'd like to have you explain why it was that in the 19th century, Indiana was a very liberal state." He was right there. We were the first state to have a state insane asylum, the idea of taking people away from the larger society. We pioneered in penal reform, in providing services for the deaf, and so on. We had a number of firsts in the 19th century, a very progressive state. In the 19th century, we had the most liberal divorce laws, perhaps, of any state. People came to Indiana to get divorced, as they would go to Nevada now. But in our own time, we've moved in the direction of considerable political conservatism. I think part of it's people coming in with certain values, retaining those values, and maybe fitting into a particular pattern and not wanting to change. I like to say the typical Hoosier is probably Richard Nixon. Now,
You better explain that.
I make that argument because Nixon's mother did come from Indiana. She was born south of here, a few miles. His whole family was actually from here. His father, of course, was from Columbus, Ohio. But he argues, at least in his Six Crises and his other books, that his mother was more of an influence than his father was. And I think she, as a long-term Quaker, sort of held the family together. I think in many ways she had what I would think would be typically old-line Hoosier values, and I think they rubbed off on him. Good many Californians are transplanted Hoosiers or transplanted Hawkeyes, and I think that the New Age value systems that Californians have now are probably relatively late in forming. And it seems to me that here is a person politically that reflects maybe Hoosier values, coming from a kind of liberal background, but taking a conservative position. And I think maybe that's what Indiana is, a kind of liberal culture that has become more conservative.
You look at Indiana from the 19th century, Dwight, didn't we really become what was indeed the western border, or part of the western border of the United States, where people were leaving the East, pioneers, people who wanted something different, wanted to change, to 20th century America, which were in the middle of the heartland, that were rather isolated on top, bottom, and both sides, that, geographically we're different people.
Yeah. The two major immigrant groups of the state were the Germans, as Ron indicated, and the Irish. Both shared certain Catholic values, although there were a number of German Protestants who came in, and I suppose that has some impact. They're minority groups. Catholicism in Indiana is not as strong as it is in some other states. Relatively, we're a Protestant state, and we're a Methodist state. And I think our conservatism is different than other places where you might have a Catholic conservatism. There's a religious conservatism, but it's a religious conservatism that is essentially old-line Protestant. Muncie, for example, is still a Methodist town, although the Baptists have made considerable inroads into it. So I think, again, that we're peculiar in that sense.
From a political point of view, an author by the name of Daniel Elazar has done a book where he identifies political culture, and he identifies three kinds. First of all, he talks about the individualistic political culture, which will focus upon government as marketplace. In other words, the emphasis on an individualistic political culture is upon government, but only from a marketplace business kind of focus. A second kind of political culture that he identifies is the one called moralistic political culture. That is the focus upon the commonwealth, and he means commonwealth in the sense that the state does things for citizens. It's a very active government that spends for citizens. The third kind that he talks about is a traditionalistic political culture, which focuses upon maintaining the existing order. In other words, the kind that I call the father knows best culture. So Elazar identifies Ohio and Illinois essentially as individualistic, moralistic. He identifies Kentucky as traditionalistic, individualistic. He identifies Michigan as being simply moralistic, and he identifies Indiana as being individualistic. So our emphasis here would be individualistic as opposed to moralistic. The second focus would be kind of a traditionalistic kind of political culture. And in terms of Indianapolis, I've always called Indianapolis the Paris of Indiana. And certainly in terms of political culture, we would say that Southern Democrats are probably have been traditionally, if we can get back to that word again, more active below Route 40 and individualistic Republicans have been more active above Route 40.
Yeah, what implications?
That's hard to
Hard to follow.
Show me
hard
a
to
map
talk
here.
to. I think in a sense he's probably correct. I think maybe reflecting again the tradition of Indiana not to have any large cities. When Civil War began, we only had two relatively large communities. That was Madison, Indiana, and Indianapolis, and neither one of them had much over 20,000 people. So for a large portion of that time, we were small, and most of the little towns as they grew up attempted to become dominant over their hinterland, largely through economic forces. And in each little town, you got kind of market economy. I think that would fit in. Indianapolis grew because it was a railroad center primarily. I think.
So if you look at Ohio, Ohio has three central large cities: Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. And they have many smaller towns in terms of 100,000 people or wherever. In Illinois, Chicago predominates and dominates Illinois. Whereas in Indianapolis, with its republicanism, especially in the last 20 years, the focus upon Unigov has really helped the Republicans to maintain influence in this state. And so this state has been a Republican state, especially for the last 20 years at the governor's level, whereas you find, as I would perceive it, more diversity in both Illinois and in Ohio.
Mm-hmm. That again reflects, I think, the size of the city. One of the things that interests me is that the name and the reputation of Hoosiers persists, although we have exceptions to it. There are many people in Indiana who are very sophisticated. I remember several years ago when we were making the Middletown film series, the director was very much interested and shocked to find out that Cole Porter was a native Hoosier. And Cole Porter is, of course, the epitome of sophistication. He couldn't believe it. He just wouldn't believe that Cole Porter, who lived his later life with the jet set of the day in New York and Paris and other places, had actually come from Peru, Indiana. That kind of sophistication just seems to escape people. Indiana University has one of the finest schools of music in the country, puts on more operas than a great many other places, and yet people still think of IU as the home of Bobby Knight and the Hurrying Hoosiers. They don't just think we're going to have a wonderful performance of Madame Butterfly or something like that. That's something that we don't talk about. And maybe in part, this reputation of being Hoosiers is something that we inflict upon ourselves or create ourselves by taking on that image.
Is Indiana changing? Are Hoosiers changing still today, Ron? We read about people leaving the rural, leaving the farm anyway, but has Indiana stabilized by all our small towns, all our small communities, or indeed are we changing?
I think Indiana's changing like the rest of the country. Our whole culture in many ways is becoming much more homogeneous. I would say television has a lot to do with that, but for example, you just don't hear the old-time Hoosier accent anymore. If you go out, you can occasionally find one of the older people out in the countryside who has it, but not like my grandfather did. When I was a kid, you heard a lot of people with that real Hoosier twang. Now everyone sounds like your average television announcer. So it's, in a lot of ways, the old Hoosier culture, I think, is vanishing. People are becoming, as communications improve, people are becoming much more like the rest of American culture.
The last census showed that unincorporated areas were the fastest growing segments of our population. People were moving into unincorporated towns and so on. And I think that influx, and that's happening in Indiana too, is changing the attitudes of people. You get new people in these small towns and you lose your geographic isolation. It's not just turning on the television, but it's meeting someone who's previously lived somewhere else.
But they're not moving into the large cities.
No, large cities as a whole aren't growing, right?
Larry, every quarter I ask the students, name some features of Indiana, and they name things like conservative, basketball, Hoosier hysteria, farming, cornfields. Politics, elections every 3 out of 4 years. Lower education achievement, Bobby Knight, Otis Bowen. No lottery, homogeneous population. Republican, flat land. Rural, friendly people. Traditional, family-oriented. Indianapolis Colts, automakers, Indianapolis 500, licensed branch politics.
That about covered, huh?
So these are some of the things that young people in Indiana perceive, and they also perceive a great deal of change in terms of Indianapolis, with the Pan Am Games coming, with the amateur sports capital of the world, they call themselves. And so you see a great deal of change, especially in that area of the state.
Last week we addressed the paradox of Indiana producing two recent television figures, Lee Hamilton, a congressman on one side, and John Poindexter, former National Security Council advisor, on the other. Indiana is capable of providing either or both.
Yes, I guess it is.
Well, and in terms of their particular values, the equality of the committee, because the committee represents the equal nature of people voting, and that's what politicians do. Whereas Poindexter, of course, represents the bureaucracy and the Naval Academy and the Navy and the bureaucracy and the chain of command. So, as we have two kinds of values in society representing both equality and efficiency, we also have those values represented here as well.
I think it's interesting that Poindexter came from a small town, and according to a colleague of mine whose brother taught him at the Naval Academy, he was always an overachiever. He was always trying to get ahead, perhaps, to escape from his small town Hoosier upbringing. Whereas Hamilton has always remained in a very rural district. Now, he lives in the area. Of course, it's arguable that a congressman has no home but in Washington, but he still maintains a connection with his district. So I think that in part is something of a difference.
I think also something was said in the newspaper a few days ago that Poindexter hadn't been home since leaving it 30 years ago.
So perhaps his Hoosier values have changed somewhat. We're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists, Dwight Hoover, Ron Hicks, John Rouse, for the comments and commentary here today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Bill Mosier and Mike Seaborg. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.